There's a phrase that's becoming ever more popular these days: less is more. That is to say, you wouldn't use something like one of these E-Series engines to drag a small freight train on a secondary line. The end result of that would probably do more damage to the tracks than it would actually move the cars in question. Now, this is not to say that these beautiful E-units were useless or anything like that. It's just that they were not designed to go on short rail spurs or do switch jobs. This is essentially the equivalent of swatting mosquitoes with a bazooka. Truth be told, unless you were willing to take half the freight yard and or railroad spur you were on with you, you'd need something smaller, something more practical. Now, if you're really into Alcos like myself, you'd probably think of one of these locomotives, an RS3. And yes, while this locomotive handles the practical part of more visibility, it's still kind of big for what the railroad in question that ordered the model we're talking about today, the CN, wanted. Something more like, yeah, that'll do it. This is called an RS23. And at first glance, it might look like a good old-fashioned switcher from Alco, such as its S6 series or S7 series, but there is certainly a lot more to this particular story. The main difference being, in addition to the fact that the engine was built by MLW, Alco's wholly owned Canadian subsidiary, it's equipped with what's called transition control, allowing it to operate at mainline speeds where necessary. This is unique among switchers, as switchers before this time generally operated at lower speeds, somewhere around 30 to 40 miles per hour at most. The 60 miles per hour gave this engine more flexibility and allowed it to sort of function as a mainline locomotive when necessary. And while there were modern takes on the RS3 being produced by Alco itself, these would prove overkill for the job required by the CN and other railroads. For example, the RS32 made a whopping 2,000 horsepower. Way too much for the small spurs and yards that the CN had in mind for the RS23, which in sharp contrast just made 1,000 horsepower. Half as much as the RS32. Engines like the RS32 also guzzled and or burned significantly more diesel fuel, making them far more expensive to operate, while the RS23 made just 1,000 horsepower. Incidentally, this was accomplished by a brand new variant of the 251 prime mover, in this case the 251C, cut down to just 6 cylinders. Now, one could be forgiven even if that one happened to be an Alco fan if they had claimed they'd never heard of this locomotive before, and that's because it really wasn't much of a seller, only selling 40 units, produced again by the Montreal Locomotive Works, for the domestic Canadian market. A few of these engines would later wind up in American railroads as CN dumped its fleets, as they spun off most of the rail lines that these locomotives used to operate on. Now, I'm sure a good deal of you out there are saying, hey, this locomotive sounds a lot like what the RS3 used to be. Well, you're pretty much right on. In fact, this is essentially what the CN wanted. The problem was that at this point, of course, the RS3s were up in age, the aging 244s were troublemakers, and age was not doing the 244s any favors at all. There was also the fact that the RS3 weighed more and was longer, two things that weren't practical for the tight spurs with their less maintained and lighter rail. Incidentally, CN bought the lion's share of these locomotives, produced with 34, the Sydney and Lewisburg Railroad with 3, and the Texas Gulf Spurhead Company, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, with another 3. Most notably, some of these locomotives wound up on the Arkansas and Missouri, but a good deal of these locomotives would actually remain in Canada. The unit we're watching now is a good example of this. It's owned by the Greater Winnipeg Water District Railway. This particular railroad was formed back in 1914 to maintain the aqueduct that brings water into the city of Winnipeg. In 2013, the railroad was officially folded into the actual water company operations of the city of Winnipeg. It is now responsible for the security as well as transferring supplies to and from the actual water aqueduct and water system sites. It also supplies the water intake facility at Shoalin Lake and has the added responsibility of removing contaminated materials from that location. In addition to the tasks I've already mentioned, the railroad is also responsible for transferring personnel between the aqueduct and around the general facilities of the area of Winnipeg that are responsible for maintaining the water supply. Interestingly, and very notable of this railroad, it uses streetcar-like self-propelled rail cars to transport workers around the facility and the aqueduct and the general area. Another operator of the RS-23 is the Minnesota Commercial Railroad. This small industrial line was rehabbed from a railroad line that had been almost defunct several years before, has gone through a period of tremendous growth and basically rebuilt itself back to a very much force to be reckoned with. This was accomplished by the railroad going the extra mile to assist its customers, even going to the extreme of helping customers locate by the railroad side and or constructing spurs to link their companies to the railroad. And of course, good old-fashioned customer service. The company in more recent times has reduced the amount of MLW and Alco locomotives it's been running, relying now more on GE and GM products. Mainly GE, though. The RS-23 was a very carefully inbred locomotive designed for one specific task: get into sharp, tight sidings and or railroad spurs, get the traffic out and onto the main line for a short distance to wherever it needed to go, most likely to a classification yard, so it could then be sent along on its way. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If not, feel free to thumbs down it. Please subscribe, and as always, keep the metal side down.